In your day-to-day life, you probably don't have to deal with laser tripwires, armed guards, or automatic machine gun turrets. And most people go their whole lives without ever falling into a pit. But there's one common video game obstacle we see pretty much everywhere: the locked door. Ages ago, a viewer named Doi Jetej asked about the history of lockpicking minigames. And today, we're finally going to take a look at where this concept comes from and what games did it first. I've always enjoyed lockpicking in games. I love that feeling that you're breaking the rules a little and going somewhere you aren't really supposed to be. Anytime lockpicking is an option in a game, it's usually the first skill I level up. The first game where I ever saw lockpicking was in Deus Ex. The game had a lockpicking skill that let you use disposable lockpicks to unlock doors, sort of a universal key. But as Doi Dataj pointed out, some games take it a step further with a lockpicking minigame. Again, I can tell you my first one. A high school friend of mine had Splinter Cell, a stealthy spy game where the player infiltrated various heavily guarded areas. But when you started picking a lock, the view would change to show the pins inside the mechanism. The player had to actually use their lockpick to push the pins and open the lock. You often had to do this in a small window of time before a guard saw you, and I thought this was just such a cool, innovative way to show this activity. Similar minigames can be found in Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Alpha Protocol, and plenty of other games. Another common version is the rotate the tool to the correct angle game. It's in the 3D Fallout games, and it's in Skyrim. Some lockpicking games are more abstract. Alpha Protocol also had this circuit tracing puzzle for bypassing electronic locks. Mass Effect had this symbol matching game. And then there was this other one where you had to maneuver through a sort of spinning circular obstacle course. Betrayal at Krondor had these puzzle chests that could be opened by solving a riddle. I'd like to give a shout out to the Museum of Game Mechanics, Lockpicking. It's a showcase of all these different mechanics where you can walk around and play simple versions of them. It was a big help when I was trying to remember which games had what mechanics. So who did all this first? What was the first game that let you pick open locks instead of hunting down keys? Now, if we're talking about games that have a lock-picking mini-game, we need to look at Hillsfar. It's a D&D game that came out in 1989. I played the NES port once or twice, and this was the oldest lock-picking game I could think of off the top of my head. The game presents you with a series of pins with different shapes that need to be matched with corresponding lockpicks. It sounds easy, but pulling it off within the tight time limit can be pretty tricky. If you look it up, this is commonly presented as the first example of a lockpicking minigame. But I want to look at something just a little bit older. 7 years earlier in 1982, there was an RPG called Tunnels of Doom. If you've never heard of this game, that's probably because it was only released for the TI-99 4A computer. It was made by Texas Instruments, who you probably know better for their graphing calculators. In Tunnels of Doom, your party of adventurers would fight monsters and explore the titular tunnels, trying to rescue a kidnapped king. It had a mechanic where you could open locked treasure vaults by completing a minigame and figure out the combination. The player had to spin the tumblers to different numbers and would be told if the overall number was too high or too low, and also how many tumblers were in the correct position. Each attempt had a chance to trigger a trap that would damage your characters. I believe this is the first game with a separate lock-picking minigame. But we're not done. What about lockpicking without a special minigame? It's pretty common in RPGs to handle lockpicking with a simple skill check. It's based on the character's stats, maybe their equipment, but it's a random roll. The player doesn't actively do anything. So in these cases, you often need to bring along a thief or a rogue to handle any sort of inconvenient locks you might stumble upon. This idea traces back to at least 1937 with Tolkien's The Hobbit. The dwarven adventuring party in the book makes it pretty clear that if you're going to go raiding a dungeon or a dragon's lair, you need to bring along a burglar.
That's why we need a burglar.
Good one.
When it comes to games, we can look at the early days of Dungeons & Dragons. In 1974, Gary Gygax, creator of D&D, published an article in the gaming magazine The Strategic Review. the Thief Edition had new rules on how a thief character could hide, disarm traps, and pick locks. These rules were later reprinted in the Greyhawk supplement and became a standard part of D&D play. CRPGs based on D&D often adapted these rules. You see them in games like Pool of Radiance, Eye of the Beholder, and most games made by SSI. This continued into later CRPGs like the classic Fallout games, Arcanum, Baldur's Gate, and so on. But which was the first game with this sort of stat-based lockpicking mechanic? Now, there's a few examples to look at. The first Ultima game allowed players to unlock chests with a magic spell, but that's not really lockpicking. When I first started looking into this, I thought the answer was Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This game comes up pretty often when we're talking about gaming first, and my early research made it look like this was the answer. It seemed to be the right one, and I even recorded a version of this video with that as my answer. It wasn't until I started trying to get some video of the lockpicking in action that I realized my mistake. You see, in this game, players often come across chests protected by various types of booby traps. The players have to make checks to identify the type of trap, and then attempt to disarm it so that they can open the chest safely. But it turns out the game didn't really have any lockpicking. The chests aren't actually locked. You can just open them right up, if you don't mind setting off a trap and getting a face full of poison gas. It wasn't until Wizardry 4 in 1987 that the series had lockpicking. The Ultima series also added lockpicking in the fourth installment in 1985. This game added the ability to jimmy a lock, though the manual describes it as using a magic key, so even then it's a little iffy. I couldn't find an earlier RPG that had some sort of lockpicking skill check. Most sources I could find pointed to Pool of Radiance, which didn't come out till 1988. So is Tunnels of Doom in 1982 the first game that allowed players to pick open a lock? Not quite. There's a few other games we need to take a look at. One game that I was really surprised to see was Castle Wolfenstein. Now, the newer Wolfenstein series actually does have a little lockpicking game, but this obviously isn't what I'm talking about. I'm also not talking about Wolfenstein 3D, the first-person shooter released in 1992. Nope, we're going back to the very first Wolfenstein released in 1981. This game allowed the player to open locked doors and chests via lockpicking. The player would stand next to the locked object and begin trying to open the lock. Then after sufficient time had passed, it would open. The tricky part was pulling it off around the movements of all the patrolling guards. But I've got one more example that's even earlier. Morton's Fork was a combination text-adventure RPG. It was released on the TRS-80 and Apple II computers in 1980. It was the third game in the Maces and Magic trilogy. There's not a ton of info out there on this game, and I couldn't manage to get it running on my modern computer, so I'm basing this off a few reviews and articles about the game that I've come across. It doesn't help that the phrase Morton's Fork also describes a philosophical concept and a move and bridge, which muddles up the search results quite a bit. So the game has the player entering a castle and trying to recover various treasure. There's some randomized combat, but most of the obstacles and puzzles are predetermined. This screen, shown near the start, has some clues and mentions that keys to hidden riches may take many forms. This is a hint that to solve one puzzle, the player must find a hairpin and use it to pick open a certain lock. Now, mechanically speaking, the hairpin is just a key that you find for this lock, but I'm still going to count it. Because this is the earliest example I could find of any sort of lockpicking in a video game. This was a hard one to nail down, but I feel pretty good about this answer. There's not too many text adventures that predate Morton's Fork. It's possible there might be an earlier example. A command like use paperclip on lock is the exact sort of thing you see pretty often in these types of games. But it does seem like it was much more common for locks just to require a specific key or maybe a combination that the player had to find. Return to Zork had players pick a lock with a wire. There was a game called Stranded in 1984 with a lockpick item, but these examples came later. Pettit 5 and similar mainframe games often pop up in our searches for the earliest game to do something, but it doesn't look like the usual suspects had any sort of lockpicking. So for now, I'm calling Morton's Fork as the first game to ever let you pick a lock. Castle Wolfenstein with the first repeatable lockpicking mechanic, and Tunnels of Doom with the first lock-picking minigame. Thank you to Doi Jataj for this question. They also asked about hacking minigames, but this video is long enough as it is. We might take a look at that another day. As usual, if you think I've missed something and know of an earlier example, please let me know. Do you have a favorite lockpicking minigame? Or is there some other question or mystery that you'd like me to look into? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.